Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Damon Levine, and I'm a facilitator here at Prude. And I want to welcome you to our ongoing Black History Month speaker series. This is a series of free, interactive online talks by presenters from around the province who will share stories on many subjects related to both Black history in New Brunswick and the present-day Black community here. So these talks include subjects ranging from Black loyalists and refugees to famous firsts, entrepreneurship, personal uplift, and poetry reading. So today's guest is currently a member of the New Brunswick Black History Society, the Black Loyalist Heritage Society, and the Tomlinson Lake Hike to Freedom, as well as a graduate student in history at the University of New Brunswick. He volunteers with the Beaverbrook Art Gallery and the York Sunbury Museum, assisting in developing material to express the Black perspectives. Besides researching for his master's, he spends most of his time engaged in other projects depicting the lives of the maritime Black community, with a hope of developing a wider social awareness of the historical significance of the Black community in this part of Canada. He'll be talking today about liberty, freedom, and glory, New Brunswick, and the Black Atlantic. It is my honor to welcome Mr. Graham Nickerson. Graham, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Hi. So, today I'm going to talk about the century following the Treaty of Paris in 1763 through to the end of the American Civil War. Roughly, I ended up as these things tend to take on a mind of their own, and so there is a little bit more about French colonialism in the area preceding 1763, but it lays a good groundwork for what comes later. So one thing that I would like to acknowledge is that I hope that people who are in the audience, they realize how much time Black historians and allies put into this research. And really, for me, I can speak for myself, the goal is that people take this information and they pay it forward to affect some kind of social change. So without any further ado, let's go on to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about, like I said, the century after the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And like I said, also, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the French period, which is outside the scope of what I originally intended, but I think it's important. Then just for a level of clarity, when I talk about Africans, I'm referring to Africans who come over as enslaved people and are ethnically African, first generation. Then Creole will refer to Afro-Caribbean people or Afro-Europeans. African-American, I refer to people who are first generation African descendants or say second generation who still have a cultural imprint of Africa on them. And then Black refers to all of those groups together from their cultural origins. And excuse me, the reason that I want to make sure that that's clear is because there is a significance in how we call people and stages of Blackness through time. And when we get back into the 1600s, those people are different than Blacks in, say, 1850. So we have to keep that in mind. So the other thing is to say that this is a small slice of the Black experience. So North America really represents a small sliver of the entire existence of the Black interaction with slavery and the New World. And just to make sure that we acknowledge that. Okay, next slide, please. So Blacks in Acadia. So I'm showing you a quote by historian William Riddell in 1925, who is suggesting that Acadians never had slaves and more also to sort of say, like, culturally and philosophically, they are not, they don't support slavery. And that would be pretty indicative of attitudes towards that period of time, right up until fairly recently, at least the 60s. A lot of historical work just sort of recans, repackages really racialized work that was done a century before and presents it in essentially the same way. So I am going to look at, so if you can go to the next slide, and that should be the triangular trade video. And so when we talk about triangular trade, we should be, and is that actually playing? I don't see it playing. Or do I play it? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So it's a try and make a conceptual model of the actual people who partook in triangular trade. You have sort of the simple triangle of colonial powers with materials moving in a triangular fashion. But people in this area and in the New England states and in the Caribbean, they're small vessel owners and merchants who are traveling back and forth between colonies, and they're shipping raw materials like lumber and wheat from here, and then returning from the Caribbean with slaves and selling them. So we're taking a perspective of the Black Atlantic and looking from the ocean towards the land, or from the islands towards the continent. And so when we look early on in Black footprints in French history, we have there's a person called La Liberté who was in Port Latour, Nova Scotia, in the early or the late 17th century. And so he has a connection with St. John, because Latour had a colony in Port Latour, or Cape Negro is where La Liberté lived, and at the mouth of the St. John River. And then we know, so Champlain is the one who named Port Latour, or who named Cape Negro Cap Neg. And he would have had a Black pilot interpreter named Matthew DaCosta, those who are familiar with that name. So he was a French, a Creole interpreter, guide. And so he may have been with Champlain when Champlain went by this cape. And I don't have a reliable translation of the Champlain logs. I've heard several versions of it, but it goes to say that Champlain was aware of Black people. He could have called Cape Negro Cape Black Rhinoceros, but he didn't.
Graham, question for you. Are you referring to the place that I guess was up until recently called Negro Point here in St. John?
No, this is Cape Negro in Nova Scotia. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is because Latour, Sir de Latour, had a trading post at Cape Negro and at the mouth of the St. John River. And Champlain, who named Cape Negro in Nova Scotia, also has ties to Port Royal and to was it Ile St. Croix, I think, in the Passamaquoddy. And in accounts of all of those locations, there are documentary evidence of Blacks being involved.
Oh wow! Okay.
So it's hard to putting borders around provinces and those sorts of things. They don't really serve the Black diaspora very well, because it's kind of segmenting a population that was, by and large, similar and quite widespread.
I hear what you're saying. And when you refer to Point de la Croix, I guess that's at the mouth of the St. Croix River between New Brunswick and the state of Maine, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, and so also thanks to my colleague, Stephanie Pettigrew, we have a petition in 1710 in Port Royal in Nova Scotia. The Acadians there end up petitioning the British, who had conquered the territory, that the Acadians were made to work and being treated like black slaves. And so that's in 1710. So the Acadians were quite aware of blacks, of enslavement, and the derogatory way that black enslaved Africans were treated under French colonial rule and British colonial rule. So if we can go on to the next slide, you will see on the left is the Code Noir. And so that was implemented in 1685. It is sort of the contemporary of the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. Too many numbers. So, and those documents, they really legislate how chattel slavery is going to function for the next 200 years. And you'll find elements of it right up until the end of the American Civil War, when slavery is finally abolished here, or not here, but in the U.S., in North America. Okay, next slide, please. So this image is a woodcut by who's the guy who did it? Thomas Davies. And so this is from the mid 18th century, and it's the burning of Grimross, which is now Gagetown. But this sort of raid and reprisal was occurring between the French and British and the Dutch as well for almost a century before, if not a century before this. And so in 1696, Major Benjamin Church raided up the St. John River, and one of his accounts is he chased off some First Nation, and there was a black who had apparently been captured by the French and from Marblehead, and so he was reclaimed and brought back to the 13 colonies. So there actually was a post on the Atlantic Canada Study Center about privateering during this period in time, today, as a matter of fact. And so you should take a look over there for a little bit of this. So it's kind of timely, because really what we're looking at is we don't really know why this guy was there. Looking at it from a perspective of, the Acadians never even had slaves, then that gives you one perspective. But we know that there were plenty of black mariners starting to pop up at this time. So it may have been that he was on a ship and captured during these privateer raids and taken onto a French vessel and was a sailor for the French, or he may have been a runaway. We don't really know. And we need to mine the sources much more thoroughly to get a better idea of what's going on with black people during this period in time. But it is to say, though, that we have plenty of accounts now of blacks being spread out through this region. And there's work by Ken Donovan on Fortress Louisbourg, where there are hundreds of blacks under French rule, enslaved black people. So we know there are lots of blacks here, and it really impacts how far back, and especially when you start to look at DNA and things like that within the black population as we move forward in time. There are wave after wave of black migrants here, either voluntary or involuntary, that have a story that aren't well served simply by, say, the black loyalist narrative or through the black refugees. Okay, next slide, please. So once the planters sort of assert themselves on the vacant land left after the Acadian expulsion, we see that there is a network constructed or taken over by the planters as well to bring enslaved people into the Maritimes. So this slide is showing an account by James Simmons to merchants in St. John, Hazen, and Jarvis about a slave that he had who was being problematic. So not only do we have evidence of the slave network, but we have evidence of Black resistance to enslavement going back here. And you can look through the records, and you can see where there's always these hints of Black resistance.
Sure, sure. You know what's fascinating about this, Graham? If you don't mind me just
yeah, sure, go ahead.
What's fascinating about what you've discovered with your research is that the narratives and the things you're discovering are very similar to the narratives and the reports that come out of the States during the chattel slavery era, and it just goes to prove that the Atlantic world back then, which was totally involved in slavery, was quite similar in this regard. Whether it was British North America, or the French and their island, or whatever. The way slavery happened in all the places were similar, and of course you see reports here about that. My question for you, and if I'm jumping ahead, just let me know. Have you come across much information on Blacks who, after the the American Revolution, didn't, like you said, didn't fall into the Black refugee narrative, but also didn't fall into the Loyalist narrative? They didn't stay in Canada, but they didn't go to Senegal or Britain, that went back to the States. Have you encountered much on Blacks who decided to make their go in the northern states as opposed to staying in Canada?
Yeah, there is, if you take, I think we're best served to remove national boundaries
sure.
from the equation, and you just think of regions in North America that at any given space and time, and they change. So it may be at some specific time, there are places within New England that are much more progressive than elsewhere.
Right.
And so Black people will know, right? They'll find out.
Yeah.
And people will go there.
Exactly.
And then as things change, they go other places. And so there is plenty of evidence in Maine where there are Black populations. I think, in fact, that and it's one of the complicated things is that our surnames change. And so over time, your ancestors may have one name, and then you go further back and it's some other name.
Sure.
And it's not only just because a lot of the time it's whoever wrote it down the way they wrote it,
right, the
way they heard it. But other times there is an African tradition that you have several names, and depending on how you're under the context, you use the appropriate name, right? Go ahead.
I always got the idea that for Black people back then, in the 18th, in the early 19th centuries, as you said, national boundaries didn't matter. It was really all about where can I live, the least harassed life? Where can I actually, thrive? And I feel like Black people went to where other Black people were. So if that meant coming up to the Maritimes and not really fitting in, or not really being able to do what you need to do in St. John's, so you go to Halifax where there are many more Black people, you do that. Or maybe you go down to Boston where there are many more Black people, or maybe you go to New York where there are many more Black people. But obviously you don't go to Atlanta because you're going to be probably put into slavery. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence in moving. I mean, let's jump ahead in time simply because you asked, and I wasn't going to talk about it, but I am now.
Okay.
There is the Free Black Mariner Act in the South that prohibits Blacks from the North from going there because they're full of ideas. And it's the same sort of thing as they prevent Blacks from Haiti from entering the South because they're full of ideas of freedom. And they do nothing but stir up trouble when they go to the South with their fancy tongue.
Right. And this was called the Free Black Mariner Act, was it?
Yes. Yeah. So if you look at that, it meant that Blacks had to be quarantined on vessels, or if they were found ashore, they would be thrown in jail.
Sure.
If you were really unlucky, you might even be sold before you have a chance because you couldn't appear in court. So Blacks had no legal rights whatsoever.
Right.
So,
understood.
you're just sitting there in jail, and some guy comes in and says, "Oh, you belong to so and so now," and off you go.
That's your life. Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to step out now, and I'll let you continue.
Yeah. No worries. So back to 1767 in the St. John River Valley. So we do have a we already have set up this pattern of slave a slave purchasing and a ring, basically a slave ring, and black resistance. So as Damon had alluded to, there is whatever is happening in the northeast of the U.S. and in the middle states or middle colonies is happening here. So we have people who are selling enslaved people. They're going to make sure that you realize that this person that I'm selling you is not troublesome. This person I'm selling you is well mannered, or nice to look at, or really useful in the kitchen, or that sort of thing, to address this concern that is expressed in this quote. It's basically that this black person I'm selling you is not like this troublesome Negroes you've heard so much about. I have only the best Negroes to sell. Okay, next slide. So this brings us to Joshua Major, who's a very good bridging point between the French and planter societies in this area. So he is originally from the island of Jersey, I believe, and he's a Huguenot. So he has connections with the whole fisheries enclave who moves over to take over from the French. He has ties in Britain and in the Caribbean and in the 13 colonies. So he is based out of Halifax for part of his life, and he's basically shipping raw material, fish, hardwood, wheat, and rum and those sorts of things around. He's shipping some of this stuff to the Caribbean, so he has his little vessels going down and selling materials. And, well, you've got an empty hold or place in your hold. Why not buy a few slaves and bring them back? And so when we looked at that little part in the Caribbean where you see all these vessels of different nations looping around and doing small transactions, this is really what we're looking at. And so he doesn't, he's going to make money. So he's known to have sold people and materials to the French, sort of not really within the aims of the colonial British power, but definitely in his own self-interest. And so what I was talking about with the last slide, you can see here, it's like just imported. And so it's a Creole woman from the Caribbean. So we're looking at along already a lineage from Africa to some level of enculturation in the Caribbean of this hybrid culture that exists there then and the descendants today. And then if you look at the rest of the ad, I mean, it's all about how you would sell chattel slaves, right? Trying to flog your wares. Okay, and so let's head on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the next thing, I'm going to show you an animation. And so one of the things that has been argued, I didn't originate with this, but I really tie in, I really believe that this is the way it should be portrayed, is we're looking at the black loyalists, and there is this picture painted of black soldiers in red coats and fighting. And I think it's better to look at them as black insurgents who are a continuation of black uprisings, slave uprisings in the Caribbean that go back into early periods. And basically, if you plot this over space and time, you can see this continuum of resistance to colonial rule by blacks. So when we're looking at the planter and colonial society changing towards the 1770s, whites are are getting ever frustrated with royal rule and just seems arbitrary decisions. But blacks are part of that, not only part of that protest, but they're also becoming less and less satisfied with their place in society. So what we one of the things I want you to keep in mind, or a few things here, is 1772 is the Somerset decision. So Lord Mansfield rules that slavery is incompatible with English common law, which this verdict ties way back to the Magna Carta, and just it evolves to include more and more people who are not supposed to be enslaved while in England. So this only pertains to England, but it puts the writing on the wall, really, of British attitudes. And of course, the verdict gets news of this verdict travels with black seamen all through the Black Atlantic. And excuse me. Also, note at the end of this video, there's in 1785, there's still black resistance going on around the area of Savannah, Georgia, in which there is a black loyalist maroon colony outside of the city that's hidden away, that is only crushed in 1785, 1786. The other thing that should be taken note of is that I'm not including blacks who joined the French. So there are blacks in the French army during this conflict. There were some ships in the French Navy had up to half the crew were blacks from the Caribbean. And I'm not including black patriots like the blacks in Rhode Island who fought for the Patriots. So I think a more comprehensive map would include those people as well, and just to see how that impacts resistance. So the other thing that I did was I plotted the British forces in the major British armies during this period of time. And it would be interesting to see where the American or the Patriot armies were and where the French armies were and what was going on. But I mean, this is the start of something much, much bigger. But one thing you can see is that there does seem to be some unrest in the Caribbean, and all of a sudden there are British military units there, both to protect from the colonial powers, the increasing number of British enemies, but also to make sure that the slaves don't take advantage of this time to rise up. And I think you will see a diminishment of uprising in the Caribbean replaced by uprisings on the mainland. And I think that's primarily because of the presence of so many Imperial Navy vessels and army or military units that would have been stationed down there, either French or English mainly, but also Spanish and Dutch and whoever else that the English were at war with during that period. So you can go ahead and play the video, please. Okay, so next slide. Okay. So, we went one too far, I think. So it should be the Loyalists is what we should be on. Oh, and back one. Thank you. So, like I said, a lot of colonial military presence probably influenced a great deal the amount of uprisings in the Caribbean, whereas the British were invested in creating as much slave unrest as possible on the continent. And so I basically plotted any instance I could find of blacks who are armed or acting in a way that they probably were armed or traveling with white provincial units to would have upset the social order. So then when the war is over, we are looking at the evacuation. And so a lot of the attention gets spent on New York City, but in reality, the evacuation lasts much longer than that. So we can go ahead and look at that video, and I'll just talk about it. So the first group of blacks who leave the U.S. actually occurs in, 1776, and after the evacuation of Boston, and that's the Company of Negroes. In 1782, and we have about 3,400 who leave Savannah for Jamaica and St. Augustine. And then at Charleston the same year, we have 5,000 who leave for Jamaica, East Florida, Nova Scotia, Great Britain, Germany, and plenty of other places in the Caribbean. And then New York at the end in 1783, we have about 3,000 enslaved and free blacks who leave. And so Carles estimates the number to be around 14,000, but this number is really not very firm. And we know it's probably not very likely that it's 100,000. That was a claim made by Sylvia Fry. But we just really we don't know. I don't think we will know until like the body of research and documentation of all the people in space and time where blacks exist and are documented. We kind of need to trace them and figure out how they got there.
Graham, question for you. Did the Brits leave any of the black fighters behind?
We know in 1775, Lord Dunmore abandoned a number of blacks in the Chesapeake simply because people were dropping dead left, right, and center of smallpox.
Yeah,
and he had to leave them.
Okay.
And then in New York City, it ends up being at the end of the war. The Treaty of Paris. There's a Article 7 in the treaty stipulates that all materials looted by the British need to be returned to the Americans, and that was intended to include enslaved people. So there are. Oh, go ahead.
So, and did the Brits actually give over those enslaved blacks?
Mostly not. General Carleton, he says these people were free when I got here. I can't turn them over. Yeah. And by and large, the British were like, well, we know that we promised these people freedom, and if we that now renege on it, this revolution is sure to spark spin-off conflicts.
Okay.
And if we go and promise freedom or promise something to these other insurgencies, and we don't deliver now, they're not going to believe us moving forward. So it's in our best interest. And I mean, not to take it away from the British. I think they genuinely saw that okay, these are people that are now free, and we have no right to re-enslave them. Mm-hmm. But also under the Articles of War at that time, those, if you just can step back and say as material, the Americans had no right to demand that material be returned.
Okay.
And by the by, I mean the Americans were doing the same thing, stealing black people from the British and raiding, and they weren't returning that stuff.
Sure, of course not.
And in the treaty, they weren't supposed to harass the loyalists either, but they did. So the British were like, "You're not adhering to this treaty. Here's all these reasons we're not going to." And so it's only the blacks who, like at the end of the war, the blacks who've tried to get into New York,
Right.
the British agreed to sort of say, no, you can't, you can't come with us.
So, in other words, there were blacks who were enslaved, but who didn't fight for the Brits, who tried to go to the Brits and say, "Take us to wherever, take us to somewhere in the Commonwealth," and the Brits said, "No, we're only taking black fighters."
Well, it's over time. So Dunmore, there's a number of people. Dunmore is the one who gets the most attention, who made proclamations to free. So his proclamation was specific to blacks who could bear arms.
Sure.
Free men and blacks who could bear arms. And so that's his. But then there is the Phillipsburg Proclamation, which I'm sure you are quite familiar with, that frees all blacks, and that's in 1779.
Okay.
And it's like any blacks who cross the line can do that.
Oh,
and we know also from the Southern campaign that the British were using hundreds and hundreds of blacks to build fortifications, and so it's such a complicated topic that has been represented in such a simple manner. It's sort of like when people say the Black Pioneers. There is not a single Black Pioneer regiment. There are like guys like Thomas Peters who are in the war for the duration and have an established military career. But then there are like the British show up at some place and it's like, here come the French and Americans. I've got 500 black people. 300 of them are going to build this fort, and 200 are going to take this surplus armaments, and they're going to go off and act as irregular troops. They're going to forage. And so it's hard to say I didn't or did serve the British, because most of them did.
Sure. That makes sense. With the troops that Dunmore left, I think it was in Chesapeake, it was Virginia, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And you said the smallpox was ravaging the people down there. So was it a case of even the soldiers, the black soldiers, or the black fighters who didn't appear sick were thought to be carrying smallpox, so the Brits left them behind?
No, they took as many as they could.
Okay.
So most of the healthy people were left behind, but the Lord Dunmore and the Ethiopians and basically the British flotilla, they centered on Gwin Island in Virginia.
Yeah.
And so the Americans were harassing them endlessly, and essentially they just never had any respite, and it was almost impossible for Britain or Lord Dunmore was I think a pretty talented strategist in terms of like he could see, and he was an advocate for arming blacks for the entire duration of the war.
Right.
He couldn't get support by and large, but he was not a very good tactician, and so they were bound to fail. And so it just, anytime that it seemed like they were going to get the smallpox under control or whatever, or things were turning around, a whole raft load of new blacks infected by smallpox would show up. And then, so you can well imagine just the demands logistically and tactically that this would inhibit any chance of British success.
Sure. Understood.
And that's after, so there's the Battle of Great Bridge, which Dunmore blunders into an ambush, essentially. And of course, in true nature, it's sort of like the black troops that take the blame, right? But it's black people can't fight, blah, blah, blah.
Sure. Yeah. I got it. Quick question for you, and this is slightly off topic, but it actually is on topic with something you covered earlier. Peter was just curious whether there's any evidence of Matthew da Costa being in this region before Champlain arrived in 1604.
That's a good question, and
perhaps with Cartier or the Basque and Norman fishermen.
Yeah, so it seems that trade Portuguese Creole or Pidgin is the lingua franca of the American Northeast. So there is a language that's common in the Northeast and a similar language that exists in coastal Africa and probably in the Caribbean, that these people all can communicate with each other. Okay. Which is why you see through time. I mean, we're talking Matthew da Costa is in the late 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then blacks are still acting as interpreters for the British in 1780.
Yeah. Okay.
So and I don't know, like, there may be somebody who's done a lot more of the study of this topic to see how this all happens, but there is a process in which Black people become the inheritor of the cultural assets of First Nations. They fit in with the communities early on. They inhabit the same places, and culturally, you find that they're somewhat similar. And there's a lot of actual intermixing with basically offspring that are half First Nations and half Black. And in fact, like people like David George have some Native ancestry. There are plenty of them out there. And I'm sure most Black people who get gene tests, they have all kinds of fancy DNA in their background. Mm-hmm. And it's all from this period of time.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay. So let's look at the Loyalist evacuation. So we already did that. Let's look at refuge. Okay. So that seems to be where we're at the end of that slide. I don't know, is there a way to bring those circles in one at a time? I can go through it either way. It doesn't really matter. But they're the fancy PowerPoint transitions. Okay, so that's all right. I can. It was more to keep me on task than anything. So when we look at this map, and we're talking about this period in time, I had initially this talk. If you look closely, refuge wasn't part, and I just kind of didn't even think about this period in time because it seems to be a historical black hole sometimes. So refuge is referring to 19th century slavery, essentially, but also going back into the late 18th century. So if we look at the Caribbean, we'll start there. So 1791 is this beginning of the Haitian Revolution, and that really is a watermark for Black enfranchisement. And so again, when you look back at the triangular trade patterns, all of these islands, they all have different colonial rulers. You have all these Black sailors who are traveling around from island to island. And when we talked about earlier about where Black people go, well, all these people are aware of, like, oh, the French have more lenient laws right now. So Blacks, when they try and flee an oppressive situation, they're going to head off to Haiti or wherever. There is some evidence that the influx of Black loyalists from the U.S. also fed into rebellion in the islands. There are Black loyalists who are implicated in, say, the Haitian Revolution and other uprisings. Much like there are Haitians who are implicated in, I think it's the Vesey Rebellion as well, Haitian sailors. So all of these ideas of freedom are percolating through the Caribbean and onto the mainland. And so then the next point of interest is Sierra Leone. And so 1792, the Black loyalists from the Maritimes, and in 1791 from London, there are two separate expeditions to Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone becomes this nucleus of abolition in Africa. And so what you see as time moves forward, especially with the outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 in Britain and 1808 in the United States, that the anti-slavery squadrons, when they intercept slaves or enslaved sailors or enslaved cargo, they take them to Sierra Leone and drop them off. So Sierra Leone is also a nucleus for the resettlement of Liberia, and a lot of that interconnection So there are people from the Caribbean who are involved in that project. There are people in Rhode Island, figures strongly, Upper Canada. So this really is, if we plotted this on a map, there really is this network of interconnected Black abolitionists and their allies who are organizing someplace that they can be free.
Graham, so slight interjection here. So when you mentioned the anti-slavery squadrons, would the HMS Black Joke be part of those British anti-slavery squadrons?
I have no idea. That's an interesting name and rather ironic.
Okay, well, it's and I'm sure it's something you've come across in your studies. I know you have a lot of amazing information here. This was a former slaver. It was a former U.S. slaver that the Brits captured and then used for slave interdiction patrols off the coast of Africa, I believe.
Yep. So that would be, the slave squadron stationed off of West African coast.
Yeah.
Essentially trying to interdict all of this stuff.
Fascinating.
So then we have also, no problem. We have the War of 1812, which delivers another several thousand blacks to Britain, and a lot of them end up here in either Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. We have, of course, the Underground Railroad, which leads blacks to the north of the U.S. and then after the Fugitive Slave Laws of 1850 into Upper Canada and into the Maritimes. And we don't really have a good grasp of this whole process in the Maritimes. Joe G is somebody who's working on this, and he's probably the best person to ask about some of this stuff. But it seems that the Maritimes, the climate here is like, you don't tell anybody that you're a runaway slave or a refugee simply because you don't want anyone to know, because there's likelihood that someone will come grab you and try and sell you back into the U.S. So there's a lot of secrecy, both within the Underground Railroad, but also once people are resettled in the mid 1800s in the Maritimes. So it's hard to say. I've run across a few instances of blacks who did come through, and Ralph Thomas has pointed out there's a gentleman in St. John who came through. There's somebody in Green Hill. There's a few Nova Scotians that I've run into, but by and large, it's almost invisible. Okay, next slide. So then we have all of the social change and push basically the dissolution of the U.S. to essentially you really have two sort of American ideals. You have the North, which are mostly free. Places like New Jersey are a little bit dodgy in their status, but then you have the South, which is committed to slavery, and that's that is the root reason for the Civil War. Although revisionists try and paint it as something else, but I mean the Articles of Secession are pretty clear about it. So in our area, though, it's a little more complicated because we have socially or morally, people are pretty understanding and invested in abolition or emancipation. But financially, it's in their financial best interest for the South to win, because that's going to curtail the heavily industrialized Northeast, which creates commercial opportunities for cities like St. John and Halifax. So you do see early on in the war where, Confederate slave runners are, they're heading to Eastern Canada because they can. We're essentially neutral. After the Emancipation Proclamation, it really turns around, and by and large, most people not only support the Northern cause, or the Union. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of New Brunswickers and Nova Scotians, both white and black, who illegally travel back to the U.S. to fight for the Union. Now, some of these people do it for ideological reasons, but there's also the bounty. So the casualty rate is so high that sensible people are like, I'm not gonna. If I can pay somebody to fight for me in my place, I'm gonna do that, because everybody always expects a war to be quick and painless, and then it ends up dragging on and being a meat grinder. So that's generally, in this area, we have a real history and a tie to the Civil War that's pretty much absent from the historical narrative, especially the popular narrative. Next slide, please. So here is the USS Miami. I think it's in 1861. So there is a gentleman who may be actually in this photo, who joined right around the time this image was taken, named Augustus Gill, who's from St. John. He joins this vessel as a landsman, and a landsman, somebody with no marine experience whatsoever. And so he would have been pretty inexperienced. He was brought on and made a steward. And so if you look at this photo, if you can see it well enough, you'll see that there's a couple of groups. So over on the right-hand side, you see this cluster of black people who are all together. And those would likely be landsmen or people like contraband blacks or whatever. And they're huddled on their own. They're held in not very high regard by the rest of the crew. And then you see the scattered front and center. There are a couple of black guys who are inherently part of the crew. And they were probably able seamen who had marine experience, were good sailors, and held to some esteem by their white counterparts. And that's generally the way that the maritime industry, like, there is a significant number of blacks in the maritime trades. And as this talk sort of alluded to, they're quite important in both in their roles in the Navy, but also as purveyors of information and knowledge. Next slide. So this is the USS Hunchback, and there isn't anyone on this vessel that I'm aware of from New Brunswick, but I wanted to show it again just to show you have the segregated crew. So over on the right-hand side, you have the black sailors, and they're not distinctly apart like in the other photo, but they are they are hanging together. But front and center, you have this black gentleman playing the banjo. And one of the roles that blacks tended to play, and my grandfather and probably my great-grandfather were sort of like this. My grandfather was a tap dancer. And essentially, these guys they're on station blockade work, and they're just, it's boredom. And so they're sitting around. So having a black banjo player to entertain you would have been a rather fortuitous turn of events. So he's out in front. He's appreciated by the whites on the crew. And thus you see, like, there's this social hierarchy in this photo that I think it's important. And in this region, when you see often black mariners who are fiddle players or banjo players or dancers or boxers, any sort of thing that they excel in the sort of off-shift, off-watch times where they're doing interesting things and being entertaining and in some way ingratiating themselves with the rest of the crew. Next slide, please. So this is the assault on Fort Wagner in, I think it's 1864. And so this battle is featured at the end of the movie Glory, which is where the glory comes from. And so this image, there are several Nova Scotians and at least one New Brunswicker allegedly in this assault. So that, this is a work of imagination, but if you watch the movie Glory, they're basically, a number of those soldiers are Canadian or from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So there's a guy named George Albert or George Grant, who is a farmer from Fredericton, who joined the 51st or 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry and died during this assault. The other tie with this particular unit and New Brunswick is Edward Bannister, who was an artist out of St. Andrews. And he is the first African American to win a national award in art in the US. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And in the movie Glory, if you're old enough to have watched it, and you remember the scene where the blacks are protesting the pay disparity between the white soldiers and the black soldiers, Edward Bannister sold paintings and donated the money to the 54th to help help basically fund them so that they could continue on to protest and achieve parity, which they did. Okay, next, there we go. And so the legacy. So we're winding down here. The legacy of this whole thing, it really is, it ends up being a pattern. And we can kind of see the pattern in the recent, say the last century, because it's close and it's well documented. And it definitely continues. There are evidence of this sort of thing going on way back to the early slave revolts in New York City in 1714 and 1740. But you have this emancipation, empowerment of black people, and then you have the white push back on it. And so next slide, please. So one of the things we see as a result is we see the creation and growth of the Ku Klux Klan. So this is a photo, I think, in Havelock in New Brunswick of the KKK. And so we have this white nationalism that rises up in the late 19th century, but it also, it continues on until in waves through the teens and into the 1920s, 30s, into the 50s, right up to the civil rights movement. And so for us, it's sort of like the 8 years of Obama presidency is empowerment of blackness, and then the pendulum swings entirely the other direction, and you see populist white nationalism as a response. Next. So in Canada, again, as a continuation, we have this sort of lost cause myth that's crept into our mental ideology, and this sort of rehabilitation of the Confederate flag and redneck white violent militancy and nationalism and that sort of thing, which is built on, somehow you chip away at saying, like, this flag's not about white supremacy, it's about values of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when in reality, all the documentation is pretty unanimous that it is a symbol of white supremacy. It was devised that way. It was used that way until, the early 70s or so, when country singers thought it was a really cool way to market their music, and the General Lee in the Dukes of Hazzard, if you're old enough to remember that. So, it's basically we see this resurgence of white identity within a white power structure. So, okay, next slide, please. So, but on the other hand, you have there are quite a number of black scholars now and activists, and that built on the accomplishments of earlier generations who brought us civil rights. And so, really, there are black people who are reclaiming the narrative. And in terms of the American Civil War, for instance, we have movies like Glory and building on that, but we also have characters like Nathan Bedford Forrest and his personification of white nationalism and violence. So he was his troops were involved in the Fort Pillow massacre. And he was basically exonerated because he wasn't seen or documented as actually giving the order for the assault and murder of surrendering black troops. His troops did it without him. And I mean, aside from that, he's also one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. So when black people now look back at these sorts of things, we're creating a whole other perspective. And so there's a video coming up here that shows a powerful representation of black sentiment, really, that captures the Fort Pillow massacre and black resilience. And I thought I've got one other slide after the video, but I thought this was sort of like really a very good statement about where we are. So if you wouldn't mind going on and playing that video.
Men of color, listen to me as I speak to you. When this war first began, you asked to fight for the Union, and you were told no, that you were not needed. But now the country calls upon you, and your sable arm to save her. What shall you do, men of color? 4.5 million of your brothers and sisters lie enslaved in the South. What will you do? Will you allow them to die in the same hopeless grave? No! Or will you take up the musket and fight? No! Mr. Douglas says that freedom won by the white man lacks half its luster. Those who would be free must strike the blow. It is better that we die free men than live as slaves. Men of color, I say to you, to arms!
So yeah, that's a reenactment group for basically representing black troops in the American Civil War, and there were something like 100,000 of them. So it's a pretty significant part of the Union Army, and up until really quite recently, it was overlooked. The movie Glory really helped popularize it, but my criticism of that movie is it tends to have a white savior narrative that anything about the Civil War in which Frederick Douglass is like a supporting role, it's not putting the right people in emphasizing their contributions, in my opinion. Others may differ, but anyway, the last slide, please. So those of you who may have caught the release of the Willow Grove stamp, there was also the Royal Canadian Mint released this coin a couple of weeks ago at the start of Black History Month, commemorating the Black Loyalists in Canada, and so we are. It's not the end. I think it's the beginning of a new phase of us asserting our heritage into the Canadian national narrative, and I think it's about time. It's an important conversation to have. Thank you,
Graham. I want to thank you, and I also want to thank our audience today. Graham, what you shared was brilliant, and the way you tied together things that we would know from things that Canadians would know from their history, and things that people locally would know with events they might not be aware of, was fascinating. Tying the whole sort of Atlantic world together with Black migration and the slave trade, and just our role in the Atlantic world, over the past 400 years is something that I think more people need to know. So
I
really,
agree.
yeah, really appreciate it. Graham, before you go, are you presenting anywhere, or where can people find more of your work?
More of my work. So I tend to do a lot of, well, before COVID, it was social history in places like King's Landing or the Hike to Freedom.
Yeah.
Black History Month, I tend to do a number of presentations. I think my next presentation, my public presentation, is with York Sunbury Historical Society in May. And so that, if you follow them, you'll see it'll be another version of this presentation with more research, probably. And every now and then I get an article dropped somewhere, so you'll find me there.
Okay, excellent. So Graham, I want to thank you again for today's very informative presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I want to remind our audience that Graham's presentation will be archived, so you can listen to it at your leisure. It'll be up in a few hours on the Speaker Series website. And I want to remind everybody that we have historian Stephen Davidson returning tomorrow at 11 in the morning, 11 a.m. to talk about Black loyalists, particularly Black loyalists who left New Brunswick for Sierra Leone. And then on Saturday at 2 p.m., we have Joe G., who Graham did mention today. He runs the Tomlinson Lake Hike to Freedom, which is in Perth Andover, I believe. And basically that was one of the terminuses of the Underground Railroad. And Joe will be talking about the Underground Railroad. That's Saturday at 2 p.m. So definitely join us at those times. Graham, thank you, and thank you, everybody.